The desert felt endless. A long stretch of road cut through dust and heat, leading to a small petrol station that looked almost forgotten by time. The wind moved slowly across the sand, carrying that dry, hollow silence you only hear in places far from cities. And in the middle of that stillness stood one man. Steven Seagal. Asterisk, asterisk. No security team. No spotlight. No dramatic entrance. Just a black leather jacket, black gloves, dark sunglasses, and complete calm. His motorcycle rested beside him as he refueled, movement steady, unhurried. He didn't look around for approval. He didn't scan the area nervously. He simply existed in the moment, grounded, composed. Then the silence broke. Engines. 1, 2, then several more. 7 motorcycles rolled into the station, surrounding the space with noise and dust. The air shifted instantly. Laughter echoed. Boots hit the ground. They circled casually at first, like predators testing distance. One of them removed his helmet slowly. Well, he said with a grin. Look who decided to stop in our stretch of road. The others chuckled. They saw a lone man. They saw someone older. They saw someone quiet. What they didn't see was discipline. Steven didn't react to the noise. He finished fueling his bike and placed the nozzle back with the same control motion. No sudden movements. No tension in his shoulders. The leader stepped closer. Don't you know this isn't exactly tourist territory? Still, no response. Not weakness. Not fear. Observation. There's something unsettling about a person who doesn't rush to defend themselves. Something powerful about someone who refuses to match chaos with chaos. The bikers had numbers. They had volume. They had presence. But the man in black leather had something else entirely. Stillness. And sometimes, stillness says more than intimidation ever could. The desert wind picked up slightly, dust swirling between them. 7 engines idled. One man stood unmoved. And in that moment, before a single word of escalation, something subtle shifted in the atmosphere. Because confidence that doesn't need to announce itself is the kind that makes others question their own. The engines didn't turn off immediately. They idled. Low, heavy, intentional. The sound wasn't just noise, it was pressure, a psychological tactic, a way of saying we're here, and we want you to feel it. But Steven Seagal didn't react to the pressure. He replaced the fuel cap carefully and adjusted his black gloves with slow precision. No trembling, no sudden glance over his shoulder. His breathing remained steady, measured, controlled. One of the bikers leaned back against his machine, studying him. You always this quiet? He called out. Another smirked. Maybe he's thinking of a movie line. Laughter rippled through the group. They expected irritation. They expected ego. They expected a reaction. What they didn't expect was patience. Steven turned slightly, not fully facing them yet, just enough to acknowledge their presence. His sunglasses reflected the desert sun, giving nothing away. There's a certain kind of confidence that comes from experience. Not the loud kind, not the performative kind, the quiet kind that has nothing left to prove. The leader stepped forward, boots crunching against the gravel. You lost? He asked, tilting his head. This stretch belongs to us. The statement wasn't about land. It was about dominance. Territory, in moments like this, is psychological. Steven's expression didn't change. I'm exactly where I need to be, he replied calmly. No sarcasm, no threat, just certainty. The words landed heavier than they expected. A few of the bikers exchanged glances. It's easy to intimidate someone who reacts emotionally. Anger gives you something to push against. Fear gives you something to control. But composure? Composure is difficult. One biker casually nudged Steven's motorcycle tire with his boot. Not hard enough to cause damage, but enough to test boundaries. Still nothing. Not because he didn't notice, but because he did. Years of martial arts training aren't just about movement. They're about awareness, reading posture, recognizing intent, understanding energy shifts before they become action. Every stance, every step closer, every tightening of a jaw. Steven was observing it all. The leaders circled slightly, trying to catch eye contact through the sunglasses. You think standing quiet makes you strong? Steven finally turned fully toward them. Strength wasn't in his posture alone. It was in his restraint. "Noise doesn't make you powerful," he said evenly. That sentence caused a subtle change in the atmosphere. The laughter faded a little, because deep down, everyone understands that truth. The desert wind swept between them again, carrying dust across the forecourt. For a brief second, the only sound was engines and the faint hum of distant heat. 7 men had come in loud, but loudness had met something unmovable. One biker shifted his weight, suddenly less certain. It's strange how quickly energy changes when intimidation fails. They had assumed alone equals vulnerable, quiet equals weak, outnumbered equals controlled. But the man standing before them wasn't calculating escape. He wasn't looking for backup. He wasn't posturing. He was simply present. And presence, real presence, forces others to confront themselves. The leader folded his arms, trying to regain the upper hand. "You're either brave," he said slowly, "or you're foolish." Steven paused for just a moment. "Neither," he replied. "Just prepared." That word lingered in the air. Prepared. Not aggressive. Not reactive. Prepared. And suddenly, the numbers didn't feel as certain as they had moments before. Because when someone stands calmly in the face of pressure, it makes you wonder what they know that you don't. The desert air felt thicker now, not because of the heat, but because of expectation. 7 bikers stood in a loose circle, engines still rumbling softly behind them. Dust drifted across the petrol station forecourt, catching in the sunlight. The scene looked tense, but strangely controlled, like a moment suspended just before something irreversible. At the center of it all stood Steven Seagal, still calm, still grounded, still unhurried. One of the younger bikers stepped closer, testing proximity. He leaned in slightly, invading personal space on purpose. "You don't look scared," he said. Steven didn't step back. He didn't step forward either. He simply held position. That subtle refusal to adjust unsettled the biker more than any aggressive reaction could have. Another man walked behind Steven slowly, circling, attempting to create the feeling of enclosure. It was a classic intimidation tactic: surround, compress, dominate. But intimidation only works when the target accepts the role. Steven's breathing remained steady. In moments like this, most people experience an internal rush, adrenaline, anger, panic. The instinct to prove something. The instinct to defend ego. But discipline changes that instinct. Discipline slows time. The leader folded his arms, watching carefully now. The earlier laughter had faded. This wasn't as entertaining as they had imagined. One biker lightly tapped Steven's shoulder from behind. "Hey, we're talking to you." The tap wasn't violent, but it was deliberate. A challenge. Steven slowly turned his head toward the touch. Not sharply, not aggressively, just enough to acknowledge it. His sunglasses reflected the biker's uncertain expression back at him. "Are you?" Steven asked quietly. The tone wasn't mocking. It wasn't threatening. It was measured, and that measurement created discomfort, because when someone refuses to escalate, it removes the script aggressors expect to follow. Another biker scoffed. "You think you're better than us?" Steven shook his head once. "No." The answer was simple. No explanation. No insult. No superiority. That response did something unexpected. It removed the conflict they were trying to build. The leader stepped forward again, now standing directly in front of him. "You're outnumbered," he said flatly. The statement wasn't loud anymore. It was probing. Steven nodded slightly. Yes. No denial. No bravado. Just acknowledgement. And somehow, that made it worse. Because fear usually tries to hide from reality. Confidence doesn't. The wind picked up again, fluttering the edges of his jacket. Engines continued humming in the background, but the earlier energy, the loud confidence, had thinned into something more cautious. One of the bikers muttered under his breath, "This guy's weird." But it wasn't weirdness. It was composure. True composure creates a mirror effect. It forces others to see their own behavior more clearly. And what had started as playful intimidation was beginning to feel unnecessary, even foolish. The younger biker who had stepped close earlier took half a step back without realizing it. That single movement didn't go unnoticed by the others. The leader noticed too, and leaders don't like losing psychological ground. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "You're very calm for someone alone." Steven finally removed his sunglasses slowly. Not dramatically, not theatrically, just deliberately. His eyes met the leader's directly. "Being alone," he said quietly, "doesn't mean being unprepared." Silence. No shouting. No threats. But something shifted definitively in that moment. Because calm, when sustained long enough, begins to feel immovable. An immovable presence makes numbers irrelevant. 7 men had arrived expecting control. Instead, they were facing something they couldn't quite measure. Not aggression, not fear, but steady, unwavering self-command. And that kind of strength doesn't need to raise its voice. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected. The desert wind moved between them, lifting thin spirals of dust across the petrol station forecourt. Engines idled, but no one revved them now. No one laughed. The energy had changed. At the center stood Steven Seagal, no longer just a quiet traveler passing through, but a presence impossible to ignore. The leader held his gaze, trying to read him. Most confrontations follow a predictable rhythm. Noise, posturing, escalation, reaction. But this rhythm had broken. Steven hadn't filled the silence. He had allowed it to grow. And silence, when sustained confidently, becomes a statement. The leader shifted his stance slightly, attempting to reassert authority. "You think we're playing games?" he asked. Steven tilted his head almost imperceptibly. "I think you're deciding what kind of men you want to be," he replied evenly. That answer didn't provoke. It redirected. And redirection is power. Aikido, the martial discipline Steven had studied for decades, isn't built on collision. It's built on using energy without clashing against it, on guiding force rather than meeting it head-on. In that moment, he wasn't fighting. He was guiding the atmosphere. One of the bikers scoffed quietly, but it lacked conviction. Another crossed his arms, no longer leaning forward aggressively. The tight formation they had created around him began to loosen, just slightly. The leader stepped closer again, reducing the distance between them. "You don't seem worried." Steven met his eyes steadily. "Worry is useful when it prevents mistakes," he said, "not when it creates them." The words weren't dramatic. They were instructional. And that shift from confrontation to instruction subtly placed him in a different position within the dynamic. Not a target, not a challenger, but an anchor. The desert sun reflected faintly off his jacket. His posture remained relaxed, shoulders down, weight evenly distributed. There was no visible tension in him, and that absence of tension unsettled the group more than aggression ever could. People expect resistance. They expect raised voices. They expect ego, but they rarely expect composure that refuses to bend. The younger biker who had earlier invaded his space now avoided eye contact. The leader noticed it. A fracture in group confidence had formed, small but real. "You talk like you've seen things," the leader said cautiously. Steven gave a small nod, enough to know how quickly situations spiral when pride takes over. The statement landed differently, because pride was exactly what had brought them there. What began as entertainment, spotting a famous face alone in the desert, had turned into a test of dominance. But dominance requires participation, and Steven hadn't participated. He had observed, measured, allowed space. The leader exhaled slowly. For the first time since arriving, he seemed uncertain, not of Steven's physical ability, but of the direction this encounter was taking. "What exactly are you implying?" he asked. Steven slipped his sunglasses back on calmly. "That strength doesn't need witnesses," he said. Another pause. No dramatic reveal. No display of physical skill. Just clarity. The bikers looked at each other briefly, and that glance said everything. They weren't facing someone trying to prove himself. They were facing someone who didn't need to. And that's when the realization quietly set in. If he had wanted to escalate, he would have. If he had felt threatened, it would have shown. But instead, he had remained centered, as if this moment had already been resolved in his mind long before it began. The leader took half a step back, a subtle retreat, but noticeable. The circle around Steven widened just slightly. No one announced it. No one acknowledged it. But everyone felt it. The power dynamic had shifted, not through force, not through fear, but through restraint. Steven adjusted his gloves once more, not in preparation for conflict, but as if concluding something. "I'm not your opponent," he said calmly. "Unless you insist on making me one." That wasn't a threat. It was a boundary. And boundaries, when stated without emotion, carry weight. The engines still idled, but the roar had lost its edge. 7 men had arrived expecting to control the narrative. Instead, they were standing inside one they hadn't anticipated. Because the greatest shift hadn't been physical. It had been psychological. And once perception changes, so does everything that follows. The circle had widened. Not dramatically. Not in a way that anyone could openly admit. But space had returned. And space changes energy. The desert wind moved more freely now between the men and Steven Seagal. What had started as a tight formation of intimidation had loosened into something uncertain. The leader noticed it. Leaders always notice shifts in atmosphere. He cleared his throat, forcing a short laugh that didn't quite land. "So what?" he said, folding his arms again. "You think a few calm words make you untouchable?" Steven didn't respond immediately. Silence again. But this silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was reflective. "I don't think I'm untouchable," Steven said evenly. "I think I'm responsible." That word caught them off guard. Responsible. It wasn't what they expected to hear in a confrontation. One of the younger bikers frowned slightly. "Responsible for what?" "For my reactions," Steven replied. "For what I escalate. For what I allow." The leader smirked faintly. "Sounds like philosophy." "Discipline always does," Steven answered. There was no sarcasm in his voice. No attempt to belittle them. Just a steady tone that forced them to listen instead of react. Most confrontations feed on ego. One person challenges. The other defends. And somewhere in the middle, pride makes the decision. But ego had found no fuel here. Steven wasn't competing. He wasn't posturing. He wasn't trying to win. And that was unsettling. Because when someone refuses to compete, the competition collapses. "You're outnumbered," the leader repeated, but this time it sounded more like a reminder to himself. "Yes," Steven nodded calmly. "And you're together." The bikers glanced at each other. "That's the difference," he continued. "Together isn't the same as united." That sentence lingered longer than the others. Together is proximity. United is purpose. The younger biker shifted his weight again. His earlier bravado had faded into something quieter. Curiosity, maybe even doubt. The leader narrowed his eyes slightly. "You think we don't have purpose?" "I think you're looking for something," Steven said. "And it isn't me." The desert felt vast again. The noise had faded into the background. Even engines now seemed unnecessary. Moments ago, this had been about intimidation. Now it had become introspection. The leader exhaled slowly, tension leaving his shoulders in a way he probably didn't realize. "You talk like you've been in fights," he said carefully. Steven gave a small nod. "I've been in enough to know the real ones aren't physical." That shifted something deeper. Because everyone standing there knew he wasn't entirely wrong. Physical confrontation is visible. But internal conflict, insecurity, pride, the need to prove dominance, that's the fight most people never admit they're having. "You could have reacted," one of the bikers muttered quietly. "When we stepped in close." "Yes," Steven said simply. "You didn't." "No." "Why?" Steven looked at each of them briefly before answering. "Because strength isn't about proving what you can do. It's about deciding what you won't do." Another silence. But this one didn't feel tense. It felt thoughtful. The leader rubbed the back of his neck, a subtle break in posture. "And what exactly wouldn't you do?" he asked. "I wouldn't let someone else's ego decide my behavior." The words were calm, direct, and they removed the last trace of aggression from his face. The younger biker looked down at the gravel beneath his boots. Moments ago, he had wanted entertainment, excitement, something to post, something to laugh about. Now, the moment felt different, less thrilling, more revealing. "You think we're just insecure?" the leader asked, though without the earlier bite. "I think everyone tests power at some point," Steven replied. "The question is whether you test it to dominate or to grow." The desert wind swept between them once more. No one moved closer. No one challenged him. Because the confrontation they had come looking for had transformed into something else entirely. A mirror. And mirrors aren't always comfortable. The leader finally looked around at his group, not for approval this time, but for awareness. The energy that had arrived loud and confident had softened. Not defeated, just reconsidering. Steven adjusted his gloves one final time. You don't need to control the road to feel powerful, he said calmly. And you don't need to corner someone to measure yourself. The leader met his gaze again, this time without mockery. You could have embarrassed us, he admitted quietly. Steven shook his head. Embarrassment teaches fear, he said. Understanding teaches change. That sentence landed deepest of all, because it wasn't about winning. It wasn't about dominance. It wasn't about reputation. It was about restraint. 7 men had arrived looking for a display. Instead, they had encountered discipline. And discipline doesn't humiliate. It reveals. The engines were still running, but no one seemed eager to rev them anymore. The desert no longer felt tense. It felt exposed. Not exposed in a threatening way, but in a revealing one. 7 men stood where they had arrived with certainty, and now that certainty felt thinner. The dust that had once swirled dramatically around roaring engines now drifted quietly across the petrol station forecourt. At the center of it all stood Steven Seagal, unmoved, unrushed, unshaken. The leader looked at his group, really looked at them this time. The earlier excitement had dissolved. No one was grinning anymore. No one was trying to impress anyone else. Moments like this are rare. When noise fades and clarity steps in, the leader cleared his throat. So what now, he asked. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't mocking. It was honest. Steven glanced toward his motorcycle, then back at the group. Now, he said calmly, you decide who you are when no one's watching. That landed differently, because the desert had no audience. No cameras, no crowd, no applause, just choices. One of the younger bikers removed his helmet fully and ran a hand through his hair. He looked younger than he had moments ago, less hardened, less certain. We were just messing around, he muttered. Steven nodded slightly. I know. He didn't say it sarcastically. He didn't accuse them. He didn't exaggerate what had happened. He acknowledged it, and in doing so, removed the need for defensiveness. The leader shifted his weight. You weren't worried at all? He asked. Steven considered the question. Awareness isn't worry, he replied. It's preparation without panic. That distinction lingered. Preparation without panic. Most people confuse calm with ignorance. They assume someone who doesn't react must not understand the situation. But sometimes calm is the deepest form of understanding. The leader glanced at the loose formation of his group again. They had arrived united by noise. But now they stood united by something quieter, reflection. Steven walked slowly toward his motorcycle, not turning his back carelessly, not moving abruptly, just steady steps. He lifted the bike upright with controlled ease, not as a display of strength, but as a natural motion. No one moved to stop him. No one felt the need to. You think we would have pushed it further? One biker asked quietly. Steven paused beside his bike. That depends, he said, on what you were trying to prove. The leader exhaled through his nose. That we're not weak, he admitted. The answer surprised even him. Steven nodded. Strength doesn't announce itself, he said. It doesn't corner strangers. It doesn't require witnesses. The younger biker looked at the ground again. Then what is it, he asked. Steven put on his helmet slowly before responding. Strength is knowing you don't have to escalate to feel respected. Another silence. But this silence was different from the first one. The first silence had been loaded with challenge. This one carried understanding. The leader stepped forward, not aggressively, not challengingly, but openly. You could have embarrassed us, he said again. I wasn't there to win, Steven replied. I was there to leave. That simplicity held weight. Not every situation needs a victor. Sometimes maturity is choosing conclusion over conquest. The engines that once roared as symbols of dominance now sounded almost unnecessary. One by one, a few bikers turned them off completely. The desert returned to its natural quiet. The leader extended his hand slightly, not for a dramatic handshake, but as a subtle gesture of acknowledgement. Steven looked at it for a moment. Then he nodded once. Respect doesn't always require touch. Sometimes recognition is enough. "You're not what we expected," the leader admitted. Steven secured his gloves firmly. "Most people aren't," he replied. He mounted his motorcycle with steady control. Before starting the engine, he looked at them one final time. "You don't need to test strangers to test yourselves," he said. "Real growth doesn't come from intimidation. It comes from discipline." The leader absorbed that quietly. No sarcasm followed. No challenge. Just acceptance. Steven started the engine. Smooth, controlled, steady. Not a roar. Just power under restraint. As he prepared to pull away, the younger biker spoke up once more. "Hey." Steven paused slightly. "Thanks for not turning that into something else." Steven gave a small nod. "Make sure you don't either," he replied. Then he eased forward, the motorcycle rolling across the gravel and onto the open desert road. No one followed. No one shouted. 7 men stood watching dust trail behind him. Not defeated, not humiliated, just thoughtful. Because sometimes the strongest decision isn't about overpowering others. It's about choosing the direction you ride next. The desert road stretched endlessly ahead. The sound of the motorcycle faded gradually into the distance, swallowed by wind and open sky. Dust settled back onto the gravel forecourt of the petrol station, restoring the quiet that had existed before 7 engines had torn through it. For a few long moments, no one spoke. The bikers stood where they were, not frozen, not defeated, just thinking. The leader removed his gloves slowly, staring at the road where Steven Seagal had disappeared. "That didn't go how I expected," one of them muttered. "No," the leader replied. "It didn't." What had started as entertainment, a chance encounter, a moment to assert dominance, had turned into something far less comfortable and far more personal. A mirror. Most people assume power is loud. It revs engines. It steps into space. It demands reactions. But what they had just witnessed challenged that belief. The youngest biker kicked lightly at a loose stone. "I thought he'd react," he admitted. "Everyone reacts." The leader nodded slowly. "That's the point," he said, because reacting would have made it simple. An argument, a shove, a display, a winner, a loser, predictable. But nothing about that encounter had been predictable. Instead of ego meeting ego, they had faced discipline meeting impulse. And impulse had quietly dissolved. One of the men leaned against his motorcycle and exhaled. He wasn't scared. It wasn't said as admiration. It was said as recognition. The leader shook his head. "No," he agreed. He wasn't. And that truth lingered more heavily than any physical confrontation would have. Fear usually leaks out in subtle ways, in tone, posture, breathing. But there had been none of it. Only control. Only presence. The wind picked up again, sweeping across the open landscape. The station attendant, who had wisely stayed inside during the tension, peeked through the window cautiously before returning to his routine. Life moved on, but something had shifted for the 7 men standing there. The youngest biker finally spoke again. "Why didn't he embarrass us?" he asked. The leader didn't answer immediately, because that question cut deeper than the others. "He didn't need to," he said eventually. "Embarrassment would have created resistance. Humiliation would have created resentment. But restraint? Restraint creates reflection." The leader replayed the moment in his mind. The calm tone, the steady eyes, the lack of urgency. Strength doesn't announce itself. Strength doesn't require witnesses. Strength doesn't escalate for validation. The engines that had once symbolized control now felt symbolic of something else. Noise without direction. One of the older bikers removed his helmet slowly. "We came here to feel powerful," he admitted quietly. "And?" the leader asked. The man looked down at his gloves. "And I don't think that's what power is." Silence again. But this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was absorbing. The desert has a way of stripping things down to their essence. No distractions. No city noise. No crowd approval. Just you and your choices. The leader looked at the space where they had stood in a tight circle earlier. 7 against 1. And yet somehow, they hadn't been the stronger presence. He inhaled deeply. "Start your bikes," he said calmly. But this time, it wasn't in order to intimidate. It was simply a decision to move forward. One by one, Engine started, not revving loudly, not aggressively, just enough to carry them onward. Before mounting his bike, the youngest biker paused. "You think he was right?" he asked. The leader met his eyes. "About what?" "About not needing to escalate." The leader considered it. "I think he's had more fights than we ever will," he said quietly. "And he chose not to have one today." That choice carried more weight than force ever could. Because real power isn't proven in conflict. It's proven in control. The group mounted their bikes. No formation this time. No dramatic departure. Just movement. As they pulled onto the open road, something felt different. Less about territory. Less about dominance. More about direction. The desert stretched endlessly, offering space not just for travel, but for thought. Back at the petrol station, the wind erased tire marks slowly, as if the moment itself was being folded into memory. No one was harmed. No one was humiliated. No one lost. But everyone learned. And sometimes that's the most powerful outcome of all. Because true strength is calm. True strength is restraint. True strength is knowing that intimidation is temporary, but discipline lasts. The encounter had never been about motorcycles. It had never been about territory. It had been about identity. Who are you when challenged? Who are you when outnumbered? Who are you when ego invites you to escalate? 7 men had arrived seeking validation. 1 man had left without needing it. And that contrast spoke louder than any confrontation could. The desert returned to silence fully now. But the lesson remained, carried down the road by both sides. Power isn't loud. It doesn't shout. It doesn't prove. It simply stands steady until the moment passes. Backhand index pointing right. Do you think they'll handle the next confrontation differently? Backhand index pointing right. If you were in that circle, would you have escalated or stayed composed? Speech balloon, comment your thoughts below.